Mark Thompson, 35 years old, a wildlife documentary cinematographer. He was on his way back to camp after finishing an early morning shoot. It had been an ordinary day of filming, just like any other, and the rising sun was painting the savanna grasslands golden. That's when it happened. A small white shadow darted into the middle of the dirt road. Mark's foot instinctively slammed on the brakes. The tires skidded across the dusty ground, sending up clouds of red dust in all directions. The car barely came to a stop. Just 2 m in front of the bumper stood a small albino lion cub. But what was even more surprising was the cub's behavior. The cub didn't run away. Instead, it stared directly at Mark and cried out desperately. In those small eyes were both fear and urgency at the same time. Mark got out of the car. He waved his arms widely to shoo the cub away. But the cub came even closer instead. It ran right up to Mark's feet, stood up on its hind legs, and placed its small front paws on his knee. And it cried even louder, even more desperately. Mark realized in that moment, lion cubs never travel alone, especially one this young. There must be a mother nearby. Yet, this cub was alone in the middle of the road, asking a human for help. Something serious must have happened to the mother. Mark looked at the cub and nodded. It was a gesture meaning he would help. The cub seemed to understand Mark's eyes and immediately turned around and it started running. After a few steps, it stopped and looked back. It was a signal to follow. Mark hurried to his car, grabbed his equipment bag, and followed the baby lion. His long experience was telling him this wasn't going to be a simple task. The cub began running across the open savanna. Mark followed behind. They pushed through waist-high golden grasslands, passing between scattered acacia trees. The hot sun beat down on them, but they couldn't stop. About 30 minutes passed. The cub's movements began to change. At first, it had run in a straight line with confidence. But gradually it was losing direction. It passed the same rock twice, then 3 times. It pressed its small nose to the ground and sniffed desperately, but eventually stopped in place and began to cry softly. The cub was lost, too. Mark approached the cub and knelt down. Then he carefully examined the ground. It was a moment when his long experience shone. Faint but clear paw prints were visible. They belonged to an adult lioness. The tracks were heading north. Mark began walking ahead. The cub trusted his footsteps and followed. Now the two had become true companions on a journey to find the mother. After walking for about an hour, a river appeared ahead. The water was swollen from the monsoon rains and rapids were swirling violently. But there was an even bigger problem. The shapes of several crocodiles were visible on the river's surface. To go around the river would take at least a day or 2. Mark struggled with the decision. The paw prints continued across the river and he had a strong premonition that the mother lion was getting closer to death with each passing moment. There was no choice. He had to cross this river somehow. Mark rummaged through his backpack. He had dried meat that he'd brought as emergency rations. An idea suddenly came to him. He quickly soaked the dried meat in water, then began rubbing it on the t-shirt he brought. The strong smell of meat seeped into the cloth. Then he picked up a few fist-sized stones from around and wrapped them tightly in the t-shirt. He needed a weight. Mark threw it with all his strength toward the downstream. A large splash erupted. The crocodiles reacted immediately. They cut through the current and swam downstream, following the smell of meat. Now Mark quickly held the cub tightly to his chest. He could feel the cub's small heart beating rapidly. He plunged into the rapids. Cold water rose to his waist, then to his chest. The current was much stronger than he'd thought. His legs wobbled. If he lost his balance, they would both be swept away. Mark gritted his teeth and moved forward 1 step at a time. 10 seconds, 11 seconds, 12 seconds. It felt like an eternity. Finally, he reached the opposite bank. Mark collapsed onto the grass with the cub in his arms, but only for a moment. He immediately got up and started walking again. There was no time to delay. About an hour after they resumed walking. The cub's gait was getting slower and slower. Its small legs began to tremble. Then, it finally collapsed with a thud. Harsh breathing could be heard, and its small pink tongue was panting. It was showing signs of dehydration and low blood sugar. This journey was too harsh for a young cub. Mark checked his backpack. There was still a little water left, but food was the problem. He'd used all the emergency rations to lure the crocodiles. Water alone wasn't enough for the cub. It needed nutrition. Mark looked around. Not far away, a herd of impalas was grazing. For a moment, one of them. No. Mark shook his head. In 10 years of filming wildlife, he had never harmed a single life. One must not interfere with the natural order. That was the principle he had maintained. Right then, something caught Mark's eye as he looked up at the sky. A flock of vultures. Dozens of them were circling in one spot. In the wild, when vultures gather, it means only one thing. There's a dead animal. Mark carefully lifted the cub. Its small body hung limply. He walked toward the vultures. After walking for about 10 minutes, a massive buffalo carcass appeared. Dozens of vultures were perched around the carcass, tearing at the flesh. Mark took out a flare gun from his backpack. He only had 3 shots left, but there was no choice. He pulled the trigger toward the sky. A red flare exploded in the sky with an ear-splitting sound. The vultures spread their wings in unison and took flight. Dozens of massive black shadows covered the sky. The sight of a wild animal feeding was unfamiliar to Mark. The cub walked weakly toward the buffalo. It sniffed cautiously, then slowly began to eat. Mark kept watch of the surroundings, protecting the cub, making sure the vultures didn't return. 15 minutes passed. The cub finished eating and returned to Mark. There was life in its eyes again. Strength had returned to its legs, too. It could walk again now. Mark stroked the cub's head. Good job. Just a little further now. Under the hot afternoon sun, the two continued following the tracks. The moment they crested a hill, Mark stopped. Ahead was a group of about a dozen rhinoceroses. The leader sniffed the air, catching the scent of a lion. Rhinoceroses have poor eyesight. So they judge situations by smell. And right now, the rhinoceros was smelling a lion. The leader exhaled forcefully through its nose and began stomping the ground with its foot. It was a signal of danger. The other rhinoceroses also began stomping the ground in unison and lined up in a row. They seemed to be preparing to charge. Mark knew how powerful these animals were. A rhinoceros charging at 50 kilometers per hour with over 2 tons of body weight could flip a vehicle. Against that, a human was nothing more than a sheet of paper. Mark froze. He couldn't run away while carrying the cub. The massive bodies began approaching, shaking the ground. His heart pounded as if it would burst. Was this the end? Right at that moment, a small baby rhinoceros leaped in front of the charging group. The leader stopped abruptly. The other rhinoceroses all halted in unison. The baby rhinoceros blocked the path of the group and wouldn't move. As if saying not to harm the baby lion that was alone without its mother. Mark didn't miss that brief moment. He held the cub tightly and sprinted toward a rocky area to the side. When Mark reached behind the rocks, he hid his body and carefully looked back. His hands were trembling and his heart was pounding in his ears. The rhinoceros group was slowly moving in another direction. And in the distance, the baby rhinoceros still stood in that spot, looking toward where Mark had been. One small life had protected another small life. Mark felt something hot welling up from deep in his chest. Mark finally arrived at the end of the tracks. Near some thorn bushes, there was a deep pit in the ground. It was a poacher's trap. The cub ran to the edge of the pit and looked down, crying mournfully. Mark also knelt at the edge and looked down. The pit was about twice the height of a person. At the bottom lay an albino lioness. She was barely moving. Only her chest was barely rising and falling. She was dying of dehydration. Mark took out his radio. Rescue team, this is Mark. Emergency situation. Albino lioness trapped in poacher's pit. Severe dehydration. Need veterinarian and rescue equipment. Sending coordinates. Copy that, Mark. We'll be there in 40. Be there in 40 minutes. A response came through the radio. Mark took out a rope and tied it securely to a nearby acacia tree. He checked the knot twice. He grabbed the rope and descended into the pit. Using his feet against the dirt walls, he lowered himself slowly. After a moment, he reached the bottom. The mother lion growled weakly. Mark slowly approached and took out his water bottle. He poured water little by little into the mother's mouth. The lion stuck out her tongue and lapped at the water. That's when it happened. Something moved in the corner. It was a large scorpion. 10 exoskeleton raised stinger. The scorpion was slowly crawling toward the mother. A scorpion's venom is lethal. A single sting can kill even a large animal within hours. The scorpion had nearly reached the mother's front paw. Its stinger trembled as it prepared to attack. Mark quickly drew the hand axe from his waist. Holding his breath, he moved 2 steps to the scorpion's left. Then he brought the axe down. The axe blade struck the scorpion's body precisely. Its tail convulsed in the air for 3 seconds, then stopped. Mark struck down once more, completely separating the head from the body. The motherline looked at Mark with relieved eyes. Mark exhaled deeply. It seemed like everything was over now. Once the rescue team arrived, everything would be solved. Both mother and cub could be saved. Mark smiled with relief for the first time. Right at that moment, a scream came from above. A sharp sound filled with terror. Mark's head snapped up. At the edge of the pit were 6 hyenas. They had come following the smell of the dying mother. The small albino cub stood in front of the hyenas with its fur standing on end. It growled bravely, but its voice was thin and trembling. Mark grabbed the rope and climbed up frantically. His arms felt like they would tear. He kicked against the wall and pulled himself up with all his strength. 30 seconds later, he reached the edge. He rolled his body onto the grass. 6 hyenas were slowly approaching from 15 m away. Mark's expression twisted. In his rush to climb up, he had left the hand axe in the pit. All Mark had left was a gun with 2 flare rounds and a field shovel. The hyenas gradually tightened their encirclement. Mark quickly fired a flare toward the hyenas. The red flare flew toward the hyenas, but fell to the ground at their feet and exploded. The hyenas backed away in surprise. But they soon approached again. They had realized the flare only made light and had no real power. Soon they gathered around the flare, sniffing and examining it. They soon looked at each other and snickered. They had realized it was just light and sound. The hyenas changed tactics. The pack split in 2. Mark suddenly remembered something he'd heard somewhere. When the alpha hyena falls, the entire pack runs away. Mark began searching for the alpha. On the left was a large-bodied hyena, and on the right was a hyena with a large scar on its face. One of them was the alpha. Mark observed carefully. When the large-bodied hyena howled, the others moved in response to its sound. Mark was convinced that one was the alpha, and he loaded his last flare. He aimed at the large hyena's face and pulled the trigger. The flare flew with red flames and hit the hyena's face. The hyena screamed and fell backward, and Mark didn't miss that moment, grabbing the field shovel and sprinting toward the hyena at full speed. He swung the field shovel hard at the fallen hyena's face. The hyena was knocked unconscious and couldn't get up. Mark looked around, but a strange atmosphere hung in the air. Even though the alpha had fallen, the hyenas were still holding their ground. They became even more aggressive. The hyena with the deep scar on its face slowly stepped forward and it howled loudly toward the sky. The other hyenas responded in unison, tightening their encirclement again. There had been a different alpha all along. Now there was nothing Mark could do. The pack leader walked toward Mark with a low growl. Mark instinctively backed away, hiding the cub behind him. The pack leader's eyes glowed red and it charged. Mark closed his eyes. There was no way out. Right at that moment, the lion cub ran forward in front of Mark. With its small body, it charged at the pack leader, and it bared its teeth toward the hyena's nose. The cub's teeth clamped onto the hyena's nose. The hyena's scream erupted. The pack leader was caught off guard. It shook its head frantically from side to side, but the cub wouldn't let go. With its 4 small legs, it wrapped around the hyena's snout and hung on. Small as it was, a predator is a predator. The hyena became enraged. It shook its neck up and down with all its might, then slammed the cub to the ground. The small body hit the hard ground directly. The dazzling white fur was instantly covered in red dust. Its small body trembled as if convulsing, and only small whimpering sounds leaked from its mouth. Mark ran. Without thinking, he ran to the cub and picked it up. The cub's small heart was beating rapidly. The pack leader approached again. The rest of the pack tightened the encirclement with it. 5M, 4M, 3M. Mark held the cub even tighter and he whispered quietly to the cub. I'm sorry and thank you. And he closed his eyes. This was truly the end. That's when it happened. A siren sound cut across the savannah. The ground began to vibrate and 2 jeeps appeared from beyond the hill, kicking up clouds of red dust as they raced frantically. Powerful headlights shone directly on the pack of hyenas and horns blared continuously. The pack leader glared at the jeeps for a moment, then bared its teeth one last time toward Mark, and it howled briefly. The pack turned in unison and disappeared into the darkness. When the jeep stopped, Mark's knees gave out and he collapsed on the spot. Still holding the cub to his chest, his entire body shook uncontrollably. The rescue team arrived. They pulled the mother from the pit with rescue equipment, administered anesthesia, and connected in 4. Veterinarians quickly examined the cub and mother and administered emergency treatment. The diagnosis was that both could be safe. However, the mother was in severe dehydration and malnutrition. The rescue team decided to transport mother and cub together to the rehabilitation center. Only then did Mark's tension finally release. 2 months passed. Mark visited the rehabilitation center every week. The cub would run to greet him whenever it saw him. And the mother also remembered Mark. The mother and cub's health had fully recovered and before they knew it, the time had come to return them to the wild. Mark felt regret, but the wild suited them better. Mark accompanied them to the conservation area on release day. Open grasslands, the very place where it all began. Mark personally opened the cage door. The mother came out first and stretched her entire body under the sunlight. It was freedom felt. After a long time, the cub followed, bursting out and running excitedly across the golden grasslands. The mother slowly approached Mark and pressed her forehead to his chest. It was the greatest expression of respect and gratitude a lion could show. Mark gently stroked the mother's mane. The cub also ran over and stood up on its hind legs, looking up at Mark just like when they first met. Mark knelt down and stroked the small head one last time. Mother and cub walked across the golden grasslands. They passed between acacia trees and headed toward the hills. The cub looked back several times, checking if Mark was still there. And finally, the two disappeared beyond the hills, returning to the wild. Mark stood in that spot for a long time, watching where they had disappeared. A corner of his heart felt moved, but he knew this was the best choice. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and like. We'll return with more amazing stories from the wild. Thank you.